Welcome back. This time I am with Demetrius Flaudas. He's a visiting scholar at Cambridge University. And I wanted to address with him some issues related to the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and how what position the West should take with respect to this conflict. First is I would like to start with something on which I agree, especially from your video, from your interview. So in a way, we are paying for the sins of the Clinton era, where the way the newborn Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union was introduced to the West was pretty much chaotic, was dominated pretty much by gangs. In moments where there was high expectations in 1991, let's remember the Russians stood up against the Soviet coup against Gorbachev, and there were times where soldiers had been 6 months without pay, and those great expectations were pretty soon turned into a nightmare, where these groups that then became the oligarchs starting taking the spoils of the Soviet era and wars in 1998 with the ruble crisis, where all that excesses were paid by the Russian population. And all that paved the path to Putin, who, yes, he came to reign on those oligarchs, but by doing so, he also brought his own oligarchs and acted pretty much like a mafia boss. What's your take, please?
Well, in what regards what you described, it is mostly true, and we're in agreement with the possible exception of the last sentence that Putin brought his own oligarchs. In fact, there have not been any, or certainly not many oligarchs that appeared in the 21st century. Everyone that we know about, in fact, started during the robber baron years of the 90s. So what Putin did is certainly ensure that Russia is not going to be politically influenced by these extremely rich people and influential, and also that they will actually distribute the turf, and there will not be infighting amongst them. So he also put them, let's say, on call to realize that if they were going to do things as they used to during the Yeltsin years, then they would lose everything within a day, as happened with Khodorkovsky.
Yeah. So, but he also brought. It's true. There was not a whole replacement, but but it's also true that he also brought and enriched people like Prigozhin.
Prigozhin was already.
He was known as a Putin's chef, and then he ended up being in charge of the Wagner Group, and after. Mhm.
Yes, okay, but I would not call Prigozhin an oligarch. Prigozhin was what the Russians say a minigarch. So yes, he had. The oligarchs are the ones who control the oil majors mostly, as well as the extraction majors like Norilsk Nickel and that kind of thing. Prigozhin was an influential strongman who did appear during the Putin regime. That is true. But even he was given and allowed to run this private
Army.
Military group like Wagner. He was not given any assets to control other than that.
Well, yeah, but he enjoyed very generous contracts from the government.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
mhm.
Still, doesn't
Uh,
make him an. If he was getting money, he didn't have any assets under his name.
um, Having said that, I wanted to move to the issue of Ukraine and other countries like Finland and Georgia. So it's from the dominant position on the articles you sent me is that, well, you have to understand that Russia has enjoyed a position, a prestige that was lost after the fall of the Soviet Union, and so Ukraine had been part of Russia, or that there were many population that spoke Russian or whatever. And for that reason, well, you have to understand that a country like Ukraine or Georgia don't really have a right to self-determination, that they have to content themselves to be part of Putin's areas of influence. And I don't, that's a point where I would set my disagreement, especially after 1994, where the West guaranteed Ukraine's independence as Ukraine had given up on its nuclear weapons, right?
We will look at the Budapest memoranda that you
Mhm,
mentioned in a
mhm.
while. For now, let us go about Ukraine. The question whether every country, every individual state is free to choose its alliances. Yes, it is absolutely free. But this freedom, as with individual human beings, entails that you will also be responsible for the consequences of your action. And Ukrainians knew, and the West that was prodding Ukrainians to join NATO was very well aware that Russia was going to react. How strongly and how badly, obviously, no one could foresee. But this was a completely well-known fact in the last 30 years that Russia exists. That hands off Ukraine, this is not going to become the West's playground. And to continue further in this pattern of thought, you talk about countries being able to choose their own alliances and to choose who they're friends with and who they're enemies with. I don't see much of this applying to places like Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela or Salvador, amongst others.
Mhm.
And everyone in the world accepts that if they do try something like that, they will suffer the consequences, as many of them have. So why is there so much American exceptionalism in this big power politics game when it is USA itself that is also playing this big power politics game?
No, on that point, I agree. So there is some hypocrisy where the West only see the right of self-determination in places that are claimed by other spheres of influence. So I'm not going to. I am an admirer of FDR and his rules-based system, even though that rules-based system then got twisted with Truman and after Truman because of the Cold War. So I'm not going to, but the fact of the matter is that Ukraine, as Finland, have a right to self-determination, right?
Yes, of course.
And that self-determination should not be threatened by Putin's imperial ambitions.
Well, first of all, the imperial ambitions, the word imperial
Mhm.
is something that reflects reality, but let us not mince words here. As I will go back to say that yes, self-determination exists, and the Ukrainians decided that they wanted to exercise it, and the Russians, as I repeat, everyone the Ukrainians and the rest of the world knew, although it was not necessarily public, it was not in the headlines back then, but anyone who was interested and involved in these things knew that Russia was going to react. So the same thing. It is a choice. If you have free will, then you should be ready to face the consequences.
Now, if you let me go, let's go to the rationale, because the rationale embraced by Putin to justify this war has gone from, first we have to protect the Russians who are living in those countries, and we know, for instance, that something similar happened in Transnistria, in Moldova, and in South Ossetia, in Georgia. And that was not the end of the issue, because after that, we have seen in those two countries, especially in Georgia, a constant efforts to destabilize those regimes. The same thing would happen in the case of Ukraine if they were forced into a humiliating defeat in which Russia can keep those four provinces, the Donbass and Crimea. And the other rationale, if you let me, is that the existential threat. But the existential threat is a rationale that also doesn't fly, because on one side they say the Europeans cannot stomach war, they are weak, they have become weak people. On the other side, they are an existential threat. It can be both.
The existential threat is not the Europeans for Russia. The existential threat can be the United States. And it was the United States that, to a significant extent, provoked Russia into reacting with this absolutely horrible, unlawful, and unconscionable invasion. This is something that we have to face. And we're not here today in order to either explain away or legitimize the war and the invasion. But what we're here doing is to discuss how did it come about and what motivated it. Therefore, in response to that, with Ukraine already having changed its constitution in 2019, and it changed in September, if I'm not mistaken. The constitution itself was amended of the country to include Ukraine's main foreign policy goals are to join the EU and NATO. As soon as I had heard about this, I knew by then that war would be inevitable. The only reason why the war didn't happen earlier was because of the pandemic.
Now, you mentioned the United States. Well, in 2014, Russia invades Crimea, part of the Donbass. And what was Obama's response? Pretty much very lenient sanctions that have pretty much no effect, were cotton balls. So that brings me again to this rationale about the existential threat, because if that's what my existential threat can present, well, then there is not such much of a threat. And I am bringing this because we need to understand to what degree we could trust Putin in a ceasefire. Because if his excuses, if his rationales for war are so weak, is what can give me an assurance that this is not going to be another Minsk agreement.
Let's comment on these things one by one. And let's start with 2014, as you mentioned, which was the invasion of the Donbass and Crimea. Now, if you ask not only the Russians, but many other analysts from developing countries, they do not necessarily see that as invasion. Don't forget that Crimea had been Russian for centuries until its borders were redrawn by Khrushchev, Ukraine's border. And of course, Khrushchev being Ukrainian, Secretary General of the Communist Party, he just added Ukraine into the administrative parts of, added Crimea into the administrative parts of Ukraine. No one got bothered at that time because obviously that would be the equivalent of changing, redrawing, electoral constituencies here in Britain. It's okay, fine, we lost it, they got it, so what? It's exactly the same. Now, it became much more important at the beginning of the 90s. And I will tell you something that most people are not aware of, that Crimea was within Ukraine, within the Ukraine Federal Socialist Republic part of the Soviet Union, Crimea was autonomous and it had its own parliament elected by Crimeans. When there was the referendum for independence for Ukraine, and the referendum turned out to be, throughout Ukraine, overwhelmingly in favor of leaving the Soviet Union and creating a new sovereign country. In a few days, that local Crimean parliament voted that they were not going to abide by this referendum, and they voted to join back Russia, because they felt that the vast majority felt that they were part of Russia. Do you know about that? Look it up. It exists. No. The representatives of the people, that's 1991, where they were up in arms, figuratively, here, that Crimea would become part of an independent Ukraine.
Well, that is a good reason to consider negotiations about what happens with Crimea, because on one side there is this referendum you mentioned, and the other half is that it was born as part of Ukraine as an independent country. So you will need to find a negotiated point. But in the case, but nothing that really justifies the invasion of part of the Donbass, because we again go back to the rationales used. It's because they are Russian speakers in these areas, but then you have the same rationale in Transnistria, in South Ossetia, and that was the prelude to destabilization of those countries. Why? So if that happens, if you give Putin that, what guarantees that he's not going to use that humiliating concession against the stability of Ukraine in order to bring another Yanukovych?
You're saying which concession would that be?
The Donbass. If given the occupied territories in those four provinces, those four regions, considering that a case apart from Crimea, of course.
Yes. Let's make also a statement quite clear that Russia did not have any territorial ambitions towards any of its neighbors, with the possible exception of Crimea, admittedly. This, they thought, it was an historical wrong, and they were hoping that one day they are going to make it right. Beyond that, there was absolutely no reason and no stated target of Russia to retrieve any Russian-speaking populations, whether those in the Baltic countries or those in the Donbass. In fact, if we go back to 2022 and in April, remember the invasion started in February 24th, and in April, after a few weeks of invasion, there were these famous talks in Istanbul about which we should speak further. Let's make a note. But at that time, Russia was probably ready to give them back to Ukraine as parts of an autonomous Ukraine, enjoying large autonomy, but being part of sovereign Ukraine. The fact that everyone, lost the opportunity to get this straightened out with far less damage, sorrow, lives lost, and all this dreadful destruction in February 2022 is something that history eventually is going to come back and bite the people who were responsible for not signing the peace agreement there.
But the autonomy that Putin was demanding for this area occupied supposedly mostly for Russian speakers is not that different from Transnistria and South Ossetia. So it was the worst part from 2022 was the demands about demilitarization and denazification, because that pretty much involved installing another Yanukovych, another puppet, turning Ukraine into Belarus, right?
Yes, of course. This is the point is that Russia, as I explained, if we take away Crimea for very specific reasons, had no territorial ambitions on anyone else, assuming that these anyone else's were going to play by the game the way that Russia, as every big power, views it. That's what's happening in the American continent right now, from Chile, from Patagonia, all the way up to the North Pole. So US hasn't, well, until a few months ago, didn't say that it had territorial ambitions on someone else. Now it has happened, but that's probably a quirk of history. But it will make sure that no unfriendly regimes ever arise. That's why in the post-war time, we have had this succession of juntas throughout Latin America. We know very well.
Let me put it this way. That's why I distrust Putin so much on this. This claim that he didn't have territorial ambitions. If let's say I am Putin and I truly believe that Russia is under an existential threat from these people in the West who cannot stomach war, who, like Obama, only throw cotton balls. But I am convinced that they are an existential threat. My first concern would not be occupying territory. My first concern would be security. And the best way would have been invoking the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to get China involved as a guarantor of Russian of Russian sovereignty over the territories the Russian Federation occupies to this day, so occupied before the war.
You really think that the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, essentially China, would actually agree and intervene militarily in a possible war between NATO, viz. the United States and Russia? No, they wouldn't.
No,
So
I don't believe they wouldn't. But the fact is that because it's very hard to believe that the West. So Obama throwing cotton balls in the case of Trump, completely disengaging from Europe. In the case of Europe, unable to, after 3 years, unable to overhaul their own fragmented defense system, it's hard to believe that they are really threats to Russia. But for effects of saving face before the Russians, that would have been a formula.
Let's talk about this threat, this
Mhm.
potential threat to Russia. As you say, the Europeans have no appetite, no stomach, and frankly, no ability for war, certainly not with Russia. And the Russians pretty well knew that. However, there are certain exceptions to that. First of all, there are the countries that absolutely hate Russia geopolitically. Namely, these are Poland and the three Baltic states. They have good historical reasons to do so, understandably, and this is what we try to actually balance out in the art of diplomacy and international relations in order to get people's nations that have so divergent histories because they believe that they have been wronged by the other side.
And you could probably add to that group Finland, who for years was forced by Stalin to Finlandization and accommodation, and was the first one to jump into NATO as soon as the war of Ukraine started.
Do you believe that it is history that, in fact, causes most of our decisions to take place, or not?
History is a condition. It places the framework where you take decisions, but also is your expectations about the future. Is that you have to match your expectations against for the future with the framework presented by history.
Yes, let's stay with Finland here. All the countries that became parts of the Russian sphere of influence, and that was the Warsaw Pact, why was that the case, you think? With one exception, one country. I will tell you. Because they were Axis countries. Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and brave little Finland, they were Axis countries. And we were fighting a war against them. They were fighting against us. So, if you want, as I see it as a very just punishment of history, that they would fall under Soviet influence. And Finland got away very lightly. It did not get occupied. It ceded one part in the South Karelia to the Soviet Union. But after that, they were free to do whatever they chose, as long as they were not going to join any alliance against the Soviet Union, Russia now.
But there were also terms of trade and self-censorship, right? They were not completely free besides the condition of no aligning with the West. They were forced to some censorship when it came to Russian issues. They were forced into conditions of trade conditions with Russia, even if they were not advantageous to Finland. So in the case of Finland, it's a bit different because there's the resentment precisely because of Karelia that was taken by Stalin to protect Leningrad. In the case of Bulgaria and Hungary, you really saw pro-Nazi factions during World War II.
We're not talking about pro-Nazi factions. Even Great Britain had a pro-Nazi faction. Oswald Mosley and his political party. We're talking about the government, the official government that actually signed the Axis Pact and sent troops to fight against the Allies. Bulgarians fought against Greece and Serbia. The Hungarians fought against Poland and Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. There's no point in making a recap of World War II. What I'm trying to say is that there's a reason why these countries, with one exception, Poland, which was with the Allies, but ended up being on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain for different reasons. Specifically, actually, because it was part of Russia, let's say, until 1918. So it was 25 years ago, nothing really. It was part of Russia, Poland, part of the Tsarist Empire for a very long time. And that's why they got it back. Going back now to the crux of the argument, territorial ambitions. Russia is by far the largest country in the world. It has more territory than anyone would ever want. It is vast and relatively sparsely populated given the territory. The last thing that they would want is to expand and administer a number of provinces that would need billions and billions for reconstruction, because this is what the four oblasti needs that Russia has claimed as its own. They never wanted to do that. If you want, Alfredo, to understand really what the Russians were after, there's one way to look at, and it's the best way. Let's not talk about what Putin says in interviews or essays or statements or analysis of our Western savants on this. What Russia really wanted, and it still wants, is encapsulated in this document that they submitted in December to 2021, 2 months before the invasion, to United States and NATO. Have you read that?
No, I must admit that I haven't read that document. Could you please tell us about what's in that document?
I will be very happy to tell you, and I will also mention that if you read this document, then you will see that this is a paragon of common sense, especially considering all the horrible things that have happened afterwards. So that draft treaty was that what were the demands of Russia? That NATO should not enlarge any further, with particular mention on Ukraine. That there would be a ban of intermediate range missiles in Europe. And I think you remember that the reason that the intermediate missile treaty stopped to exist is because the United States unilaterally withdrew from it. So what they said is, let's go back to the treaty. And then ban of NATO military activities in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, some consultative mechanisms, and the requirements that all heavy bombers and surface warships operate in international waters, avoid to be within certain limits from either side, the United States and Russia, that is. Now, with the one exception, which says no more foreign troops in the eastern part of enlarged NATO, the countries that have joined more recently, which would have not been accepted by the West and NATO. All the rest are so conforming to rationality that as soon as you read these two documents, one is addressed to NATO, the other to the United States, you will say, my goodness, is that all they wanted? But that's fair. That's how it should be. And you know what we did? We rejected it, the West.
Yeah.
And one thing that would have definitely caused trouble for us to accept, for the West, is the part that there should be no forces or weapons in countries that joined the alliance after May 1997. But remember, these are draft treaties. The Russians were expecting to negotiate on these. So they thought that they put that rather too forward argument in order to be able to play back and say, fine, we're going to give up on this.
Yeah, no, as you present them, those terms are pretty reasonable. Even though they come from the same country that destabilized Georgia and took also Ossetia, the same country that did something similar in Transnistria, who didn't respect the terms of the Minsk Accords, and that Biden should have known that Biden was, because it was happening, what you mentioned happened during Biden, that Biden was as weak as Obama when it came to so they were not inspired, for instance, for the generals who for people they in no way they were inspired by generals who were the rabid dogs of the Cold War during the Eisenhower administration or the Truman administration. So it's a bit hard to believe that the Russia could have seen Biden as a real threat when Biden was afraid of his own shadow. But of course, the terms as you present them are very reasonable. How do we jump from there to the terms presented in Istanbul?
They're about the same. In fact, if you take the terms that were actually put on the table to discuss during the negotiations in April and May 2022, you will see that the main points the geopolitical points are exactly the ones that had been submitted by Russia in December 2021, with the addition of certain clauses because hostilities had started, as in lines of withdrawal of troops, what are we going to do with prisoners of war, how are we going to repatriate dead bodies of the combatants, and that kind of thing.
But there were 2 points that were very unreasonable. Even I could swallow the lease over Crimea that was part of those. But what I would not be having able to swallow was the terms about the provinces occupied by Russia, because that had nothing to do with an existential threat. That was just land grab. The second was the denazification and the militarization of Ukraine, because that was the step before destabilizing Ukraine and turning it into a puppet state. So if those 2 points had not been present in 2022, I would have seen, yeah, this is a continuation from the memorandum they sent to Washington. But considering that the insistence of Putin on those 2 terms, the Nazification, what he understand by the Nazification, and the land grab, it's far hard for me to believe that he was sincere about any attempt at peace.
Do you think that Putin, Russia, let's forget about Putin because it has become too personal in the Western media, and that's not how the reality is in Russia. Do you think that Russia would have invaded anyone if in December 2021, NATO, and in particular the United States, because it's them who decide what NATO does, or at least definitely at the time, if they had said, yes, fine, this is a start, let's sit down and discuss it. Do you really think that the invasion would have taken place? No.
If you let me, I believe it's the terms of the 2021 were rational. But I do believe also that Russia could 50-50 have trying to destabilize because Ukraine, because of course Putin was sore because Yanukovych was kicked out of the country.
Putin, Russia would not have a problem if, let's say, Zelensky stayed in power. Let's not forget, Zelensky is a Russian speaker, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, speaks Ukrainian as second language. He's a Russian. They would have been quite happy for Zelensky to stay on as long as there were guarantees by Ukraine, countersigned by NATO and the US, because Ukraine's guarantees would mean nothing if there were still instigators for Russia behind them, that it would remain neutral, it would never join NATO, and it would never take some of the other confidence-building measures, that it would never accept any foreign armies and personnel in its territory and all that.
But that in one way or the other was proposed by nothing less by the Biden administration. Because the Biden administration, let's remember that when the war started, they didn't want to support Zelensky. The first thing they offered was him a right, and he said, I need ammunition, not a right. Inside it was the same appeasing forces that in 2023, when the year of the counteroffensive, they started rationing the help, the military aid to Ukraine, so making the war longer and bloodier that it should have been. So it's hard to believe that I am the first one to acknowledge that Biden's role in this conflict was terrible. But the matter is that Ukraine should not be punished as a consequence.
You're quite right about Ukraine being punished because it became a pawn in the grand chessboards of the big powers. And one should only express not only sympathy, but shame to all of us who might have allowed this to happen. It's a beautiful country with fantastic people, and it's now lying in ruins. And what we should have done here in the West is ensure that a peace treaty, some kind of agreement, mutually acceptable, should have been signed, preferably before the war. Well, if it had been signed in Istanbul 6 weeks, 7 weeks after the war had started, bad, but not as bad as now. 6 weeks of.
Let's assume for a moment that Putin pedaled back on the denazification and the four provinces demands, so we could have a reasonable agreement. What would have guaranteed that didn't follow the way of Minsk or Istanbul or or Budapest? Because Putin doesn't have a record of respecting his own treaties, right?
Let's take this chronologically and let's go to the Budapest agreements. And we are going to explode a number of myths here. First of all, the Budapest Memorandum is a bundle of 3 memoranda signed under the auspices of the OSCE in Budapest, and they relate to the accession of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to the NPT. That's the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Okay? Now, let's go through a number of points. First of all, are you aware, or is any of our viewers aware, that the United States itself, the State Department, has said in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, when Belarus tried to invoke it against the US, saying that you are infringing upon our sovereignty, which was part of the Budapest memoranda. You know what the State Department said? That the memorandum is not legally binding. Look it up.
Yeah, that's regrettable. It was part of Biden, the Obamas.
Sorry, that's beyond regrettable. This is serious. You are in the US, you are a citizen there. You should be actually making sure that people, your people, know how their government has been acting.
I know that is a part of the conversation, and I'm glad we are talking because we have disagreements, and you can present facts we didn't have before. Like, for instance, this approach from 2021, and the one you mentioned, the Russian proposal of 2021. But in the end, it seems it has backfired for Russia because Finland, Sweden, who before weren't part of NATO, now are part of NATO. Russia is stuck in a war with Ukraine, and he has lost influence in Syria, and even has been unable to assist Iran against an attack that was used by Netanyahu for political gain, let's be honest. So that attack didn't stop any any Iranian bomb from landing on Israel, because that bomb didn't exist. The only thing that attack achieved was closing the gap between Netanyahu and Bennett in the polls, right? So Russia has had several losses, and so now has an economy that is addicted to war, that is starting to slow down, and has signs of deterioration. Even the Russian central bank, which is pretty independent, has finally had to cut interest rates because Russia Putin has gotten many losses in the geopolitical ground just because he has stuck to this war in Ukraine. If you were Putin, wouldn't you have preferred to propose not these maximalist, ridiculous, bizarre claims that he has presented before Trump, but the same terms he presented in 2021?
The Russians have been doing that. We rejected them and kept on rejecting them. They came close.
I mean during the Trump administration.
During the Trump administration, whether they are accepting this, how easy would it be now, after all this bloodshed that has been visited upon the Ukrainians, how easy would it be for any American administration to go and say, okay, we have reconsidered our position. Now we're going to sign up between us, the big boys, and Ukraine is left to its own devices. Would anyone do that?
What I mean is that, in other words, wouldn't have been better for Putin to cut his losses before he loses more influence, because actually, honestly, he has much better plans to do. For instance, in Afghanistan, where they have entered Afghanistan to help the Taliban against ISIS-K, while providing security to the lithium reserves on which China is interested, while they can install their pipeline for their own oil. So why is Putin so obsessed and stuck with this war when he's obviously losing much more than he would have lost by cutting his losses in Ukraine right now?
It is not Putin's personal obsession. It is Russia. This is, as someone who has lived for 5 years in Russia and in 1 year in Ukraine, and because of my work, had access to some very high-level politicians in the government of both countries. This is not Putin. This is Russia. And it is so important, this Ukraine question, to Russia, that they were ready to accept these losses that you talk about, and they are true, they are real, in order to get their point across and win the situation, emerge the victors, and I mean not only militarily, geopolitically, in Ukraine.
And let me just make some interrupt you just so you can provide me an answer that is more thorough. So you are meaning that ultranationalist wing inside the Russian elite that is pushing for a victory in Ukraine no matter what, and that Putin could be destabilized by that ultra right wing. Is that what you?
Let's say that you are Russian for a minute. You're doing exactly what you're doing now. You're an analyst. You are you have knowledge and education, connections and all that. But you're Russian. And the war starts in 2022. And initially you say, what are we doing? How can we be invading? Why don't we keep on talking? I'm against it. Many people, not the majority, but it was a substantial minority who felt like that in the first months of 2022. That's why, in fact, many left the country, although according to the statistics that we have, the majority of them has returned. That's another thing that you will not hear about in mainstream media. But I digress. Let's assume then that you are this Russian, and after these first months, you see all these ups and downs of this war going over 2023 and 2024, and we had the grim celebration of the 3rd anniversary earlier this year, and we are now clocking 3.5 years. And what would you actually perceive? You would perceive that the West, the whole West, irrespective of their grandstanding and all their holier-than-thou attitude, the whole of the West is behind your enemy, and they're actually feeding your enemies billions and billions and billions in money and weapons. So that is why the approval of Putin and his policies has shot through the roof in the last 3 years. I talk to friends of mine, colleagues of mine, very westernized, and who were extremely against. They thought it was frightful, it was unlawful and a sin to invade Ukraine. And 3 years down the line, what they tell me is, well, the West is out to get us. We should fight to the end.
But I have been able to watch sometimes Russian media, and I have seen this, at least TV, because it's where the young are more in connection with the internet, but the older population is watch Russian media, and you can see many times these deranged claims about existential threat, about using nukes, about all kind of crazy stuff that obviously fits the perception of the average Russian about the consequences of a peace like the one I propose. So if cutting their losses. Actually, my question would be here, how much control does Putin have over that media to change perceptions among Russians? Because if he has no control, if they are, for instance, the bastion of the stronghold of the ultranationalist right in Russia, well, there is not much Putin can do. But if he can control the media, he can change perceptions in order to reach a position in which you cut your losses, you are free of sanctions, and you can restart your influence, Pacific influence in other countries, influence they have lost. So how much control Putin have over this, over the media and over this ultranationalist elite, part of the Russian elite at the right?
Very extensive, almost total, almost. But this is not the issue here. Certainly, Russian policies until now has not been swayed by the ultra-nationalists. Otherwise, we would have had tactical nuclear weapons already exploded in Ukraine. And this Putin, even though they know and they realize that they have been fighting against the collective West, in reality, they have reacted relatively mildly. Yes, there is a hybrid war against particular nations, against the US now, not so much under Trump, against Britain and Germany and some of the other very vociferous anti-Russian states, but that's about it. It's a hybrid war. It's they're playing with computers and hacking. Fine.
But sometimes it goes beyond that, like the attempt assassination of a defense contractor in Germany, right?
I'm sure that this is what secret services are supposed to do all over the world and are doing it. It's just that we are being fed this one incident of many, while we don't make so much fuss when we assassinate, for example, the head of the
Iranian scientists. Iranian scientists. So I don't want you to take that I am defending the West blindly. I'm very critical. I have been very critical of the Biden administration, or the Obama administration, or the Trump administration. But regardless of that, because pointing the things of Putin doesn't mean defending the things of the Democratic and Republican administrations here in the United States. But if Putin has such control over the press and he can shape perceptions of the Russians, why is not he trying to cut his losses?
What exactly would you expect if you were the president of Russia? What exactly would you do with the media? What would you tell them? Because I'm trying to figure out what this.
Let's say I need a good show, so people like a show that is credible. So first I have to embrace the narrative that is more convenient for that show. That narrative is the existential threat. I could invite China to play as a guarantor of Russia's sovereignty, that is going to be just a show, a document just for show, because that is never going to happen. And I could try to sell that to my population, to my internal population, while I cut my losses and I get out of sanctions. I provide much. I reduce the huge uncertainty in the Russian economy, and so that the Russian population doesn't start getting impatient about, for instance, the possibility of a mandatory draft just because Putin wants to go as long as it takes, and so it starts eroding its own popularity. That's what I would do.
let us make it clear that for the perceptions of Russia, this war, this confrontation, general, which includes the Ukraine war, this new East-West confrontation, is existential. And what is at stake now is way beyond Ukraine. It is the future of the world system and whether Russian Federation is going to remain a great power or not. Russia doesn't need anyone like China to defend its territorial integrity. They will nuke anyone who would attack them back to the Stone Age, if it's the West. This we understand. China, on the other hand, have very explicitly said, and it was in the media a couple of weeks ago, we want Russia to win. So
yeah, there have been an interesting evolution in the relationship between the two since the war started. You must remember that before the war, China preferred to diversify its sources. So it preferred Ukrainian grain to Russian. It preferred Central Asia's energy and Siberia too. And the more the West has been pushing Xi Jinping into the direction of Putin, the support for the Russian war machine has been more explicit. Now they are openly helping the production of drones in Russia, and compare that to like 4 or 5 months ago, when Chinese banks were so afraid of sanctions that even they avoided to process transactions with Russian counterparts in trade. So there has been this evolution that is evolving into what you was just mentioned, that now the more we have put pressure on China, the more China has gotten more openly in favor of Putin. But that also presents a constraint for Putin, because, for instance, there are red lines I believe Putin is not going to cross: nuclear weapons. Why? Because that would ruin if Xi Jinping continues his association with Putin after Putin uses a nuclear weapon, that would ruin the prestige China is trying to build in the global south. And his goals in the long term are focused on the global south. So that's a red line. Even a tactical, not a strategic, even a tactical nuclear weapon would be out of the question, because otherwise Putin is right now depending on the yuan zone. Is excluded from the dollar zone. If Putin launches a nuclear weapon just to please his extreme right wing, then where is he going to go?
Alfredo, I'm afraid that this is a repetition of the usual Western mendacity in saying us to China, well, please help me attack your neighbor, and once I've finished with your neighbor, your turn is next. Which country would ever accept that? I think we have made all our politicians have made it as clear as day for the last 10 years, and it is in the national strategy documents of the US, the UK, and several other countries, and these are much more important than what the newspapers write, that our strategic enemy is China. What would you have China do? Side with us?
No, not at all. That's not what I meant. What I meant is, okay, Putin is part of your domain. Your two are not democracies, so we are not subverting the will of the people, because there is no will of the people here. But you may have Putin as a senior partner by passing you with North Korea, or we could both together downsize Putin so he can be like Kim Jong-un, depending on you, instead of you having to depend on Russia. That's what I propose.
I am not sure that this would actually be conforming to what the Russian geopolitical interests are right now.
No,
The
but
reason
the China is the economic lifeline of Russia right now, together with India. But above all, is China. So China can set the red lines about what Russia can do. Otherwise, the economy would just crumble and fall apart.
Oh, you mean what you're trying to say is because China has this influence, and by assisting, it can tell the Russians what to do and what not to do. And one of these things would be to stop the war when the Chinese themselves say, we want Russia to win. And reading between the lines, we will do everything short of war to ensure that this happens.
That's a declaration. In the end, they have their very competitive interest.
Very much.
But Russia right now depends on China much more than China depends on Russia, and
Yes.
that's a kind of leverage they can use. So Putin can save face. Ukraine, the war may end, and Putin may be rewarded with the lifting of sanctions.
What would China gain out of that?
Excuse me?
Why would China do that? What would they gain from this?
Well, it is the security, the safety that first the prestige of ending the Ukraine war. Second, that they would not be dragged by Russia to a point of no return if there is a confrontation or even a limited confrontation with NATO. So China has an interest in having. So this Ukraine war is not in the best interest of China. China would be much better off without a war.
Everyone would be much better off without a war. Absolutely everyone. And that is why, as I said, I hope that history will show us who the culpable parties were for the continuation of this war. We know very well who started it. And we have said that it's completely unconscionable and unlawful. Let's try, and I will repeat that because I am giving you, to our viewers, arguments, not why Russia was right, but trying to, and it was a legitimate invasion, not at all, quite the opposite. But we will never understand what's happening unless we see the rationale of Russia. Now, going back to your question about China. China, as I will go back to what I just said before, China wants the war to continue because, as you said, the more the war continues, first, China has Russia becoming more and more dependent on it, and that's a geopolitical gain. Number two, the West becomes weaker, so much so that we have run out of many armaments. Number three, we do not have, our attention has shifted somewhere else, and they go around doing whatever they want in the South China Sea and Taiwan. And fourth, they have actually sat down and created with Russia a completely alternate financial system with the BRICS. And I remind you that countries, big countries with big economies, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt, and many India are part of the BRICS. And that's a golden opportunity to get away from the West's confines. Why would China ever want this war to stop without the Russian victory?
Last question before I give you the last word. And my last question is going precisely to answer your question, is that the first if that would be give precisely before countries like Brazil and India inside of BRICS and other Saudi Arabia inside of BRICS, the prestige of having ended the war. Second, to prevent the worst case scenario, that is that the Russian economy falls apart, or that the front falls apart and Russia ends up losing. Of course, the best case scenario is that Russia, for China, is that Russia wins and the war ends. But that's what's the likelihood of that to happen. So that's why I believe that China's has best interest is in the war to end, so he can keep projecting this image of peace in the global south.
It's one thing to create this image, which of course would be good, but then you saw how many things would China stand to lose if it made somehow this war to end. Not that it could actually pressure the Russians that much. They realize it. There are red lines between Russia and China as well. Now, as we said, yes, I don't think that this prestige of the peacemaker, even though Jesus Christ said, blessed are the peacemakers, has anything to compare with the prestige, the geopolitical influence and power that China is gaining by having this war continue. Now, I mentioned that, weakening the enemy, keeping them occupied, bringing Russia, which was not exactly your friend until recently, bringing and creating a very strong bond, securing your northern borders if you're China for that. So this is not going to happen with China, and they have said so much themselves.
Well, it has been a very interesting conversation. I would like to see if we can continue it in a month or two when we see what the evolution of the war, and if there is something more clear on the horizon, especially as the Russia and China's relationship evolves in the terms of getting closer and closer.
And yes, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please, because if you want to add something, I still have a couple of minutes.
A very short sentence. Why is it that Russia does not agree to a ceasefire now that President Trump has been asking, and even though the relationship is so much better? Because ceasefire is always in favor of the losing side. If you're winning, you don't do ceasefires. You go on until you win. And even though it is very important for Russia to rebuild some bridges with the United States, which is doing now, winning in Ukraine is existential. It's not just important.
I would like to add, and probably we can discuss that next time, is that a much more important reason is that, like Germany in 1936, Putin's economy is addicted to war. Any adjustment of the Russian economy at this point would be very painful and would put the stability of his own regime in peril. But we'll have to leave it here for now. I hope I could count on you in a couple of months when we have a more clear scenario in front of us.
It would be my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor Flaudas. And
I thank you for
till next time.
And for this very interesting conversation. It's always good to have someone who doesn't just listen passively, but also uses counter arguments to what I would be saying. Doesn't matter whether you subscribe to them or not, but using counter arguments brings out hopefully the best in the speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that's the idea.